Okay, so this should be audio on. Let me just check this. Okay, that seems fine. So let's properly start, I guess. So yeah, it's been quite a while since I last did a live stream. Um, Main reason for that would be just that there hasn't really been anything huge in Avatar for the most part. So it's been a weird one when it comes to like a big topic that I actually want to do a video for. Even though we've had comics that have come out since, it's not necessarily like something like I considered like, oh, should I do a Suki alone one? But I think the review covered it. So this seems like an interesting one, just to kind of get more people's thoughts on it, and then the bending discussion, I think, makes a lot of sense. I think to do more interacting with chat. So you'll see there, I put up a poll to ask which of the topics that you'd like me to do first. It seems like the winner is the RPG lore review, which was the plan in the first place. As you can see, I had the title up, so I'll just end that there, and yet we will start with the RPG review. So welcome everyone to the stream. So yeah, we'll get into the lore review sort of, I guess, straight away. So it's an interesting book overall. I think you have to factor in a few things with it, and I go back and forth about like, am I being overly harsh? Am I being like too kind to it? Because obviously I'm only reviewing it from the perspective of the lore and ignoring like 2/3 of the book. And then they did only say there would be Roku information, but there ended up actually being information in all the eras, just the focus was on Roku. So that changes things a little bit, in that if there was just nothing in the other eras, then I think it would be really unfair to criticize the book for not having information elsewhere. But it does feel like the Roku stuff was so tailor-made for the book and to fit what they were trying to do in that section, that it does make a lot of the other sections of the book sort of stand out for almost like missing pieces of information. And there's a bunch of places throughout the book where I feel that is the case. Let's just kind of go up to a bit. Again, I can't show too much of the book just because they said, not to share it publicly and stuff like that. But I'll show you a few pages just as a kind of bit of a preview, just for people who don't have it. So if I just show this, this is the map that we have in the book right towards the start. So you can see here, I went over this in one of my videos, was it last week or the week before, I forget. It's pretty substantial in that there's new places on the map, but then it does leave out some like pretty clear places that there probably should be included here. So it's odd from the perspective of it probably like, yeah, definitely should have certain places, like even something just like the Great Divide, like put it on the map. And then it does highlight as well that there are only like 2 locations in each of the water tribes. They don't really attempt to name any other locations. Similarly, like the Fire Islands, apart from the couple, they don't go particularly in depth in terms of the other ones. There's large parts of the Earth Kingdom that don't have stuff going on here. Now, again, it's one of those things. They could have, I suppose, maybe, if they really wanted to. It'd probably be way too much work. They could have went in and maybe named all 55 states, like using that piece of information they say is in the book. Now, that would have been a bit crazy to overfill the map when that would probably lock them into too much stuff. But name a few more places. That's how I think the book overall feels. And as a hardcore fan of the lore, I can appreciate learning little things, like is mentioned in chat there. The idea that we learn that the Southern Water Tribe capital is called Wolf Cove. Pretty cool. But are we going crazy about this book and being like 10 out of 10? You gave us a few place names. I don't think so. It's a bit of a kind of frustrating one. But again, there's stuff like Chenbao and Natsuo Island, which are from the Roku era, which feel like, okay, they just introduce us to these places, and they tell us a little bit about them in that era, and it's like, cool, I want to see more about that in other eras. One of the more interesting places is number 27 here in the middle, which is the Water Tribe's Sacred Island. I'd love to see that place at some point in a story, to see what they do with it. So again, this is to me the book. Like, if I was to review this book, I think the score I would ultimately come to from a lore perspective is I'd probably be 7 out of 10. Maybe 7.5 if I'm being kind, but I think it's maybe stretching it too far. Just because 1/5 of the information, very happy with the Roku information. Like, I think the Roku information kind of over delivers compared to what I expected, but I do think the other eras all under delivered ultimately. Given that there is new information in them, I think they all under delivered, and especially like, because I was saying early on, I think that the Kyoshi section of the book is probably the second best. But in reflection, I've been thinking about it more, and it's a section that is probably actually missing maybe like the most of some of the eras, because the Earth Kingdom section and the Water Tribe section in the Kyoshi era are actually very light on information overall. They're the only two nations in the entire book where they don't tell you the name of the leader. So we don't learn the Earth King in the Kyoshi era, and we don't learn the name of either Water Tribe leader in the Kyoshi era. And it really stands out because the whole book is about the social climate of the era, the politics of the era, and especially the Kyoshi era is all about politics. You don't name the king? Why? That just feels a bit kind of weird to me, that they're the only ones missing in this. And what's so kind of unique and interesting, I'd say, overall about the way they just approach things is that, like, the Roku era, they'll give us a new Earth King there, but not the Kyoshi era. That's how it feels throughout the book. So that's just the kind of frustrating kind of situation that we're in. I think I'm lagging a little bit, but there's not too much I can do with my internet. But I think it seems okay for the most part. It might have just been for a second. But yeah, like, we'll scroll through a little bit. You know, this early section, pretty nice. Water Tribes, Wolf Cove, and so on. I'll scroll down a little bit here off screen. It's one of those things, like, if you really, really enjoy just reading about Avatar, you will get a lot out of this book. Because there are sections, like, you get to, like, the Fire Nation section. It's like, okay, they go into some detail on a couple of the locations, but they don't say too much about it overall. Like Bonte Island, as sort of a kind of lore expert, I love talking about Bonte Island. I was so happy to see the Kyoshi novels go in depth on, like, reintroducing this place, like introducing the name and having us properly be able to bring this into the lore, without having to reference the fact that, like, Mike put up a script for beginnings on his website, and that's where the name comes from. Otherwise, like, the book is just sort of, yeah, it's cool to see this sort of stuff. But if you've watched the shows, you do know most of this information, and they have to repeat it to a certain degree. Like, I do get that, that this has to be open for beginners, new people to Avatar. But when you do open the door for new information, it just gets a bit kind of, just do a little bit more. So I'll try to find some other kind of sections on this. I suppose really quickly, like a little bit of a look into the section later on. In the chapter 2, which is like the canon section, there is a little page on bending. Now, it doesn't really say much about it. Like, this is not the section I'm going to go into. It's actually the chapter 7 stuff on bending that I want to talk about for the discussion topic later. But it just highlights that, okay, like, cool. Like, example of technology, helps you to run your game. Seems pretty nice. Only one page really on the spirit world. I know they're planning to do like add-on books later that include there's going to be one for Republic City, there's going to be one for the spirit world, but it feels weird that like they really kind of don't try and help you understand how to play in the spirit world. Going to the eras, like Kyoshi era, like I said, it's fine. Like, if you've read the books, you know exactly what it is. It's Dao Fei, bandits, pirates. That's kind of what you expect it to be. I think it leans into it, like, a little bit too much, to the point where, like, the Earth Kingdom section, I think, is way too focused on kind of everything except, like, the Earth King, when the Earth King, should be sort of a little bit more in play, I think. The fact that like all the characters from this era are basically just people we already know, I think is kind of weird. Like, if you look at the notable figures page, it's like Kirima, Lao Ge, Wong, Mok and Wei, and Auntie Mui. It's like, I get it. And like this is very like specific to Kyoshi, I would say. But in terms of an overall look at the Earth Kingdom in the Kyoshi era, I don't quite think that's the most amazing look into the era. They also have the Beifong family after this, which is somewhat decent. Even stuff like this, like this is actually quite a weird point. Like one of the threats and challenges, I get ultimately, the Fifth Nation is going to mainly be attacking stuff like around the Earth Kingdom, but it is weird that like a water tribe point is brought up as one of the main threats of the era. And again, it's like Dao Fei, pirates, 2 points to say bandits effectively. So you can tell that they were stretching it a little bit, that for some reason they weren't able to get new information in the same way that they could for the Roku era, which it makes me sort of question a little bit and really want to know about the process that they went through with Avatar Studios, where you get all new stuff, including a hugely significant piece of information in the Roku era. But then you come to write the other sections and either you don't try or they were refused. That's what I'm not too sure about. Like, was it Avatar Studios who basically prompted them with, here's the new information we'll give you for your book, for your game, and then they went back and forth, and then but how did that happen? And then certain pieces of information, as we'll get to, feel like, how did that get through? Like, how did that random piece of information get through, but like nothing else, nothing else at all. The extra piece of information about Druk from the Korra section of the book seems absolutely crazy that got through, because to me, that is the style of information that I was thinking they'd have for, like, there'd be a few of them in each era that we just learned this random thing about, like, Sokka went looking for a space sword or something like that. Aang found the sky bison maybe a year or two after this, like just really vague, like mentioning of that. But no, it's really just that one extra little bit. Otherwise, it's rather to the point in a lot of specific cases. So that's kind of interesting. But then you do get to something like this. So if we just open this up again, the Air Nomad section of the Kyoshi era. And you can see here that we didn't explore the Air Nomads too much, and that it was mainly Jinpa from the book. But now we get the idea of like, okay, go into the Council of Elders. You have this character Namthos introduced, this other character Matangi. And again, these two characters aren't from the book. There's stuff down here, Gemsen, Mongol. And it's like, okay, I get it. You didn't have a lot of Airbender characters in the books to go on, but like, how did you get all this stuff in here and actually create a bit more of a dynamic? It's weird. And that's the constant thing I had throughout this, is just that it really is an odd selection of like new pieces of news, information. Now, it obviously is a kind of a bit of an odd perspective to only look at the book from what is new, but of course they knew they were going to do that. The reason they have to be so specific with the standard information is because they know they'll get torn apart if they get it wrong. So they had to know, that there would be some information, stuff like that. So, it's interesting. So yeah, there's that stuff. Water Tribe, again, Water Tribe I think really stands out. It really stands out, the Water Tribe in the Kyoshi section. Like, notable figures and groups, Atuat, Tagaka, and Avatar Kuruk. Like there are other characters, like in the next page they go into the 3 new characters. But again, it speaks to this idea of like, I get it, these are the known characters, but like, the significant characters in the Water Tribe are Tagaku, who's in prison, Avatar Roku, who's the previous Avatar, who I get, because he's died so young, is going to have an impact on the era, but really? And then the 3 characters they introduce aren't even like the leaders. It's just like Old Warrior, Courier character, and Pirate. I get it, but it's unusual. Roku era, obviously, is the key thing here. And what makes the Roku era stand out so much is that they immediately kind of get you into this zone where you're like, oh, we're actually going to learn some really interesting stuff, because they say that the Roku era in the game is set like before Roku's wedding. So it's before any of the conflict between Roku and Sozin happens. So they don't even, in this era, attempt to utilize the information that we already have. They actually have to specifically say, we're not using that. We'll use the little bit at the start of Roku's training and go off that. So, interesting. But yeah, this is where the most significant piece of information comes from. And it's really great to read through, because we don't know anything about the era other than sort of the position of the Fire Nation necessarily. But let's take a little bit of more critical view about this in terms of just how insightful is this information. For the most part, I haven't seen too many people online discussing the information from the Roku era outside of the introduction of Sozin's sister, Zaysan. Now, she ultimately is, I suppose, the centerpiece in a way of the new information, because she connects into so many of the little plot threads that they're kind of introducing here. But that was the only thing that I saw from this whole book that sort of took off in a way that actually was sort of news within the fandom. Otherwise, there was just general excitement for the people who are interested in the game. The general excitement from just the fact that, like, hey, this intro section is about the closest thing to an Avatar encyclopedia that we really have. That, like, officially released in book form, of course. The wiki does exist. So that sort of stuff is cool. But all these, like, dynamics are very cool. And I think one of the biggest things about it that I do like is that, especially compared to the eras that follow this, all the little plot threads, they don't all heavily involve Roku. Roku is actually only mentioned in like a couple of them. So it really is like perfectly written here to be the background information for a role-playing game, because you don't have to just pick up Roku scraps effectively. Whereas that's the way they basically want you to play in, like, especially the Aang era and in the Korra era, is that, do you want to be the one does your group want to be the ones to take down the Earth Empire for the third time? It's like, I get it, but like that's a bit much. The Red Lotus, who, like, I get it, there are still some of them out there, but really, it felt like it was mostly resolved at the end, that like their leaders are taken out, so the Order of the White Lotus can actually like deal with the leftovers effectively. But anyway, but yeah, there's some great stuff here. Like, again, I don't want to show too much of this stuff, but like important events, like look at all this stuff. Night of Silenced Sages, and it's a perfect thing to happen in the era following the Kyoshi era of what happened. You had this massive sort of like assassination of sages in the Kyoshi era in the books. Now you have this thing that kind of reads like an assassination, even though it's just this, the high-ups changing the structure and potentially having people who disagreed assassinated. So very cool political stuff from a slightly different angle to get across that the Earth King of this era, who does get a name, but not a number. So there's another thing. Like look at this sentence right here. Earth King Jailun changes the constitution. Kyoshi and the 46th Earth King drafted. So, there you go. Why don't they name the 46th Earth King? And then why don't they give the Earth King from this era, the Roku era king, give him a number? Again, I think it's because that would require too much work. That they really do think, they would have to plan out basically every Earth King probably in or around it. That you can be like, okay, so if that's the 46th Earth King here, like we know where Kuei is and so on. We have to do the gap between it. And it gets confusing because, of course, Kyoshi being 230 was never really a properly planned out thing. They had to run with it once they realized how kind of weird the timeline is. And it affects things kind of quite like badly, in that you have a bunch of families in the Avatar universe where characters are having children they have to have had children at very old ages that don't make a lot of sense. Like, I think this is the situation with, like, effectively there's a generation missing in like the Fire Nation royal family, because I think it means that Ursa's parents had to have like been like really, really old. The same thing I think is roughly true with the amount of Earth Kings, that just because of how long Kyoshi lives, you have to account for like, oh, how many did she deal with before we get around to Kuei. It's that sort of stuff. Like, they got their numbers kind of spectacularly wrong initially and caused a bunch of problems. That the chat is of course bringing up here. Sozin, the whole Zulon stuff. Yeah, it's pretty wild. So there's all that sort of stuff. And yeah, but Night of Silent Sages, the North Passage, again, new place name, and it's literally just territory dispute, but it's cool. They mentioned Roku was sort of involved in this one initially, but it opens the door to, like, he's not constantly dealing with this, and it's just a cool little thing. The escape from the spirit world Roku becomes a plot point here. It's an interesting one. I don't think it's just the strongest plot point, but it's something that, like, Roku caused like permanent like damage to, and it's causing volcanic activity. That's interesting. And then the big thing, of course, the Fire and Air Center of Learning, which connects so many dots this is one of the cooler things that they did here, is that they didn't just introduce Sozin's sister to us. They introduced her as someone as part of the royal family who is deeply sort of ingrained in like Air Nation airbender culture. And this is this thing that's sort of sweeping across the Fire Nation. And you can sort of see why, Sozin wanting to wipe out the airbenders wasn't just to get the avatar after Roku was dealt with. He has reasons to dislike them for what happens here. Even though, obviously, the background information presented here makes it out that the Air Nation are just trying to, if the Fire Nation people want to get involved in our culture, who are we to stop them? But Sozin doesn't like that. So I do like how a lot of that stuff does get connected in here. So that's really good. Like, Dragon, always cool. I actually think the whole Grand Tour of the Unity is actually a really cool plot thread. I do really like the idea of this one. Like I said, I think on the podcast, I initially kind of read past this one of just like, it seems kind of irrelevant. But it's actually a very cool idea because, as I think Greg pointed out quite heavily on our last podcast, this era goes really in depth into the idea that this is the era of technological advancement. So that wanting to be sort of spread across the world is a very cool idea. But then the politics get involved and it's viewed as a threat start to finish. So very, very cool stuff there. So you get stuff like, the name of some of the Water Tribe characters is a little much. It's to the point where it feels like, there's just a slight sense of like, did you look at the list of like known Water Tribe names? And did no one think that this name that's like twice as long as any other Water Tribe name, we might want to, just shorten it just a little bit to match the kind of Water Tribe naming convention rather than just like the background cultural naming convention. So that's just an interesting one in that I don't think they'd ever go for a name that big if that was a character in one of the shows. But, just interesting to note that they really went kind of large with the names here, whereas we're used to a lot of, Hama, Kaya, Tonrock, Unalak, like none of them are going too long ultimately. But that's just thing for me, just doing the videos and having to attempt to say these names, which there's no like pronunciation guide. And then I think nearly every time this character gets mentioned, it's always TIQ. Just shorten it. But yeah, here we go. Princess Zaysan. So this is the thing everyone's kind of freaking out a bit about, if there is anything that people are freaking out about from the game. It's a really cool story that incorporates so much, like I said. The fact that she's a chi blocker, the fact that they utilize that to create like, chi blocking is also incorporated into like some of the air nomads know it as well. And then you add this extra layer on top of just the kind of center, the official center in the capital. You also have this other group, the guiding wind also kind of in play in all of this. Very cool idea. And a lot of this just makes me think like, coming out of this, one of the main things that I feel is that this information has to be here for like a reason beyond just this game. Because they didn't do much with the other eras, it makes me feel that they were probably able to incorporate this into this game because they were planning to do something else with it in the first place. So I do really, really hope that we get the announcement of like a novel. I think is what seems the most likely because, of course, the Kyoshi era is basically the novel era. So I think that's a really cool way to connect the dots. And again, we have that piece of news from a few weeks ago that Chronicles of the Avatar is the new sort of like background series title for the novels. So they've sort of widened it out instead of it just being the Kyoshi novel series. So Roku era feels like it was already, I think, what most people kind of expected. Feels like they have to do it now. Big question, though, is obviously going to be, will it just be a separate story set in the era using some of this information, or will it be sort of laser focused on the ideas set up here that like Zaison will be a key character, and they'll deal with all this these dynamics? Because what's so interesting, and I feel is almost like crazy that you're just leaving this to this game, is they don't tell you obviously like the fate of Princess Zaison. Like, we don't know what happens to her as such. There's an implication just because Sozin is the one that she's opposing about what happens and all the dynamics at play here. But surely you're going to tell that story. That would be really, really incredible to just flesh out Sozin more, properly introduce this character in a novel setting, and really go in depth. Because I do like in this era as well that they characterize Roku, I think, very well here. Because since the Kyoshi novels, I think a lot of the fandom has almost moved to treating Roku as like the quote-unquote worst avatar. Now, it's never a discussion I particularly enjoy, in that I've always, in a lot of my videos, been the one to be like, hey, even before the Kyoshi novels, I doubt Karuk was that bad. And thankfully I was sort of, proven like, yeah, very happy with what they did with him. And I think everyone has a better understanding of him. Kyoshi, obviously people already love the character, but love her even more now. Yang Chen, they actually created a little bit of a criticism surrounding Yang Chen, but I don't think people have moved to really hate the character or anything like that. But Roku, I think people have moved to really going at him because his decision or indecision led to the war happening. Now, I'll always defend Roku for that decision because of like the timing of the situation, in that all of the I think really notably bad things that Sozin does, at least most of what we know about, does happen post Roku only finds out about it at this point, and then the really bad stuff happens after Roku dies. And it would have been, I think, very harsh if for Roku to kill Sozin in that instance where he sort of threatens his life. Now, this is maybe the stuff that is presented here about what Sozin is doing in the background in a lot of these plots. Maybe Roku had an idea that his friend deep down was a little bit more manipulative and cruel and stuff like that. And if they do characterize it more and we get the book, maybe they will highlight that Roku has always maybe had a few doubts about Sozin, and that would flesh out the decision making there. But purely based on the content that we have right now, I think it would have been a dark move for Roku to take out Sozin at that moment. It's a very different situation than, say, how Kyoshi kills Zhu Ping on and so on. So there's that. Yeah, the only question, as was brought up there in chat there, that if it is going to be a YA book, are they going to be willing to make the main character a middle-aged Roku? Because the implication seems to be that Roku didn't have too much wild and crazy stuff happen while he was younger, or nothing that obviously stands out. He seems to have a relatively peaceful avatar journey. So that's kind of interesting. I don't necessarily think that has to be the case with the kind of YA book, that you have to use the young characters at all times. Because the YA books typically still have older characters in them. It's just going to be kind of different. But who knows? We have to wait and see what they do. Because, it'll be weird if we do go to kind of teenage Roku. I suppose the characters like Zaison, Sozin would still be there, but you'd be doing very early setup with a lot of these ideas. So it's interesting. The other point is like, do the novels have to be Avatar focused, or can they focus on other characters? I'm not sure. Just the fact that they're calling it Chronicles of the Avatar, it makes it feel like the Avatar is going to have to be the central focus, but who knows? They might do some different things. So there's that. Other like little things that I kind of like in the Roku section are just kind of like very fun things. Like this one, I suppose maybe passed a few people by, but Uzuku Yuyan, the kind of origin of the Yuyan archers, very cool idea for a character of like, basically getting across the idea that her marksmanship skill with a bow and arrow is so incredible that it's a borderline, special, unique ability equivalent to bending, and people want her to teach this dynamic to other people. But does she do it in that she views it as more of an artistic thing? Does she teach it to the military and have it be used for that? Nice idea. And I wish there was kind of more of this throughout the book, those type of like connections being made. The way I describe these ones is just the book, what it feels like is, I suppose, mostly lacking is sort of any insight into sort of what happened in the gaps between eras. It happens sometimes, but it doesn't happen other times, that they like refer back to what has just happened. They do it more often in like the Korra and the like Aang era, of course, but they don't do it too much with some of the other ones, apart from like very specific circumstances. I'd like a little bit more kind of gaps being filled out maybe. But anyway, Air Nomad stuff is, again, pretty nice. A lot of new characters. Obviously, some of the characters are only mainly here to just have like a technology expert within like the Air Nomads, and they connected in that like she designed the building, but there's not too much else there. Water tribes. I really like the dynamic of the water tribes actually in the Roku era. This also does stand out to me. So the idea that you have a very reasonable southern chief that just is trying to do their best at all times, whereas the northern chief, Skiri, is a bit of a hothead. And so there's that dynamic of kind of the south being the more reasonable one. They're actually working together in this era, and they introduced the concept of like the sacred island and so on. There's some really cool characters here. Maki took as like our kind of early proto kind of Unalaq character. I guess this confirms, like, I don't think it was we necessarily had the idea before that Unalaq invented the spirit bending technique, but I guess he maybe brought it back, whereas they kind of established that, okay, this character knows it as well. Nice connections there, like kind of more fleshed out sort of characters going on here. Even like the just addition of like the characters that we did see in the show, like Roku's waterbending and his earthbending teacher, Takukak and Sud. Just, okay, this is what they were like based on what we saw. But then Takukak's like a kind of spy character almost. He does these diplomatic missions and espionage. And then Sud has this very interesting plot point where like he's hired by the king to teach him earthbending, but he's not particularly like astute politically, so he's missing out on stuff that he knows is hugely like impactful material. Question there in chat: what do you think about the non-bender adopted air nomad? So I think that's in this section here. Which character is that? Yeah, that's this character here. Anada. Citra Anada's an engineer, orphaned in the Fire Nation, but baby, she gave her over to be raised by the Air Nomads as a nun. Can't bend, a rarity in Air Nomad society. It's an interesting concept, but it makes sense that the air nomads would take people in like this, and it just kind of highlights that this is an era where, you know, I guess the air nomads are trying a lot of things. They're stretched out. They're maybe a little bit more willing to bring people in. It's a cool idea, definitely. I do like, you know, little things like that. And again, it's in the Roku era where they're, I think, doing the most of this connection, which is quite cool. So there's that, which is, you know, pretty cool. Let's see. Question here in chat. Another chieftain, Tana. Oh yeah, that's mentioned here in the Sacred Island, which is on one such voyage, a southern chieftain by the name of Tana was surprised to find Fire Nation ships docked on the island. Okay, so this is more of the idea that the Southern Water Tribe has a group of chiefs that lead them rather than one specific person, like as such. It's a weird one where like they have, I guess they roughly elect one person, but they do more have a group of them. And there's, you know, one of the other names mentioned there. So, you know, there's a bunch of like, yeah, good information in this era. Like every little bit of it feels like good. Like moving into the Earth Kingdom, the introduction of the Queen of Omashu and her kind of feud rivalry with the Earth King is a very, very fun dynamic. You know, they roughly they get across why, I guess, Omashu has a king or queen without quite saying why they have a king or queen. It's an interesting one that, like, oh, it's an important place. It's the second biggest place, but shouldn't you have a little bit more? So there's that. There's Sud, like I mentioned before. The Grand Lector, who used to be an Earth Sage, is very good. It's very interconnected throughout all of this. And then all the ideas like Natsuo Island and the resource kind of thing. And Sozin wants that because, again, they need the metal deposits for the ships and for the big attack that's to come. Really, really strong stuff. And I do really like it all throughout. So the Roku era does deliver. Like, again, in terms of highlighting the huge moments, it is mainly Zaison, but there's enough going on here that I do like it. Okay, yeah. Does the Earth Queen have a name? Yes, she does. It's right here. So, Guozun, I'm not sure about the pronunciation again. Graceful and elderly Queen of Omashu. You know, and they go in, as a child, she idolized Kyoshi. And again, she despises the Earth King, Jailun, which is kind of fun. And then they covered this idea. Is this where they bring it up? Or I think it's a little bit maybe later down. That he has like people sabotage some of the shoots in Omashu, and she feels she can actually get one over on him by discovering that for sure he was behind it. And so there's a lot of political intrigue that I do really like in this era. That's all very cool. So I love a lot of that stuff. But oh yeah, Antoine in the chat there, thanks for the super chat. But we'll move into the 100-year war era. This is a weird one because I said this in my video where I went over this section in a lot of detail, but that this ends up being one of the more frustrating eras because they choose to set it in the middle of this 100-year period, right towards the end. So it's more of the ATLA era, because the Aang era is the comic era. So this is more of the like prelude to the show type thing. This would have been, I think, so much more interesting if they said it at the start of this era or the middle of the era. But I understand if they did that, they basically would have to have made it another Roku era where everything has to more or less be information built from sort of scratch for the most part. And that might have been too much work. We don't really know the full details necessarily. I appreciate the attempt to give us a little bit more insight into the Air Nomad genocide, but I also am still a little bit like, I get it. It's a rough topic in terms of, do you ever want to properly give major details about it, like properly tell a story about it? Is it too much? But I look at Star Wars and how so many great stories in Star Wars are about Order 66 and Jedis who survived it, and the details surrounding that, of course, makes Revenge of the Sith such a great Star Wars movie. That I would love to see what happens here. And again, Star Wars didn't need to go like 18s to tell that story, in that they've told it in multiple different kind of mediums and stuff like that. And it's worked. And I think they could do it here, because I'll bring up the trading card game again. I always do. Why is it that the trading card game still has the most information on the sort of Air Nomad genocide and aftermath period? Like, Maloo, to me, remains this absolutely fascinating character, and I really wish they would go a little bit more in depth, because the canon, the properly full-on canon comic relics, basically opens the door to the idea that, yeah, people escaped. We know they escaped. In the background information of explaining the air nomads and stuff like that, they describe that effectively in the Roku era, they're very spread out. There's not a lot of people in the temples. People survived initially. Yeah, I definitely agree with that point. Yeah, this period should have been in the middle of the war. And I think probably the way to do it is actually to make this more like the Azulon era rather than they do it like the Ozai era. Because we don't know like a ton about Azulon, and it would have been nice to kind of focus on that, because then you can have like the raid on the water tribes be like ongoing at a certain point, and you could even connect the dots and have like reference Hama, but have Hama as like water tribe before she's captured type situation and so on. You can work the timeline a little bit more that way. So what else do we have here? Yeah, important events like disappearance of Aang, Air Nomad genocide, Southern Water Tribe raids, the Siege of Ba Sing Se. So this is interesting. They give you the tiniest pieces of new information on like Iroh, Luten, and what happened, but it's so minor. Like what does it say here? Around this time, Iroh's son, Luten, was badly injured in the assault and soon succumbed to his wounds. So it's new information in the sense that, well, we didn't know for sure that like he got injured and then later succumbed to his wounds. But like, is it really saying all that much? I don't really know. I guess it just opens the door to like, yeah, there might be an emotional moment if they ever choose to tell this story, highlighting that he gets injured in an attack and is like brought back, and maybe Iroh does get to see him a little bit. So some cool things, definitely. Yeah. And yeah, the point being made there in chat that like, yeah, they only have one rule to kind of abide by, and that is just that by the time you get to the start of ATLA, that Aang is the only airbender. That's all you have to do. You can easily resolve a lot of things just because so much time passes. So that's interesting enough. The death of Firelord Azulon, that's basically just a search. I do like that they have this sort of the page here, that because there's no section on the Air Nomad genocide in this era, that they just give it this sort of like remembrance kind of thing of the Air Nomads, getting across that because we are set right at the end of the era, it highlights just 100 years of a people being gone, that very few people do remember them. That only a few Southern Water Tribe people remember them because that temple is very close to the Southern Water Tribe. It's a cool just connection to make there. Water tribes, not too much here. We have a very, very difficult to say name here once again, in our leader of the Southern Water Tribe settlement here. It's a cool idea, and I think it works. I think they play into some of the like Water Tribe scary story type stuff that Katara and Sokka talk about at times with this, which is kind of fun. And I do overall like that they incorporate like Hama and the raids, and they do bring into this era and the following era the idea of the other waterbender prisoners. That there's more than just Hama, and that even in the Aang era, they're still working on getting the elderly Water Tribe prisoners who've been in prison for who knows how long, getting them home, and that creates an interesting dynamic. A lot of that stuff I think is very, very cool, how they do incorporate it in, even though they chose the least interesting probably section of the era overall. They add a little bit on King Boomy in the Earth Kingdom section by just kind of getting across that like he's kind of like Omashu is like weapons dealing. That's how they're helping, using their kind of power as the second biggest place to get stuff elsewhere, which makes sense. They're good at shipping kind of supplies around and so on. So there's that, and then I'll mention this. Just I'll show this just for a second here. The Council of Five. Why do we randomly get the name for the other three Council of Five members, but like basically no other kind of significant like information like that? Like I get it. Here's a group of 5 characters. We actually only have the names for 2 of them. Why not, add a little bit more on here? Fair enough. But again, if you can do this, why didn't you do some other things? Like I mentioned before, Kyoshi era Earth King and Kyoshi era Water Tribe leaders. Like, why didn't they get names? Some weird stuff there. Dai Li, King Kuei, Jet and the Freedom Fighters, the Mechanist. All this stuff I think makes sense. The Fire Nation colonies get brought up here. Fire Nation section is pretty to the point. But like I said in the video, I actually like the section on Zhao is interesting because you almost forget Zhao is an important character, but then when he gets mentioned here and has all these kind of notable like things to his name, it really stands out what's happening here. So Antoine's asking in the chat, do you know if the final PDF will have more original art? I'm not sure about original art. Like, let me just show this for example. So it's the in-between chapter sections here. This is the stuff that they said aren't complete. Like, you end chapter 2, you go into blank page, and then fundamentals of play, but blank page. This, I think, is what they're waiting on approval for, is just what's filling these pages. If they're just going to choose screenshots or like stock art, I don't see why they couldn't just complete it. So maybe it has new art, but I really don't know. Because it's weird because, let me just scroll down to the bottom. The only new art in the thing really is the playbook characters, which you might have seen a few of them posted online. Like, pretty cool designs for these characters. Otherwise, it's just about like how to actually play the game. They're all like new pieces of art, but they're also not really like canonical characters. Then right towards the end of the book, actually, what am I doing here? It's already on screen. These pieces of art here that you can see on screen here for the avatars, these are all like new, but like we've seen some of them before. Like we'd seen the Kyoshi before, I believe. We've seen the Roku. I think I've seen that Roku before. The Aang and Korra image here are definitely completely new. Now, I don't know if they were made for this book or if they're just sort of new stock pieces of art that they have behind the scenes. I don't know. But, I don't know. It's a weird one. I get it. It would have been a lot of work to do new art for like every single like visual insert in the book. but we'll get bits and pieces, I suppose. So it's interesting. In the sense that, like, I think what people want, obviously, is names and like pictures of the new characters. I'd be sort of surprised if we got an official look at Princess Zaison, which I think everyone wants. Maybe, though, there might be an opportunity. I just don't know exactly how they're going to do it and make it seem kind of thematic and so on. But yeah, that's all that. And yeah, I think that's a large part of why you maybe don't see much discussion of this, like, online necessarily, is because you don't have the fun of having a lot of visuals to go with these new characters. So it's this weird thing where, like, we get some, like, really nice official art style new characters, but they're NPCs, basically. They're player characters. And then the canon new characters don't have any visuals to go with them. So it's a bit weird. But where were we here? Wrapping up the Roku era. No, the 100-Year War era. So yeah, Zhao, I mentioned him. Iroh, the section with Iroh, it clarifies the order on some of the events in his life, which is good. I do like that it does at least put into place some of the moments. Like, okay, him meeting Ran and Shaw was actually quite early on in his life. That was one of the first key events. And it's interesting that is placed there, because you might have placed that afterwards. And then it's actually the Order of the White Lotus, which is one of the things that happens sort of later in his journey, like post the death of Liu Ten. Again, I feel like Iroh's backstory probably should be properly told at this point. But we'll see what they try and do here. Because it's one of those situations where, like, I see, like, so much discussion about, like, oh, the Tales of Ba Sing Se is such an incredible episode, and everyone brings up the tale of Iroh, and it's so emotional, the loss of his son. But, like, we've had that scene for so long without ever knowing the character of Liu Ten. And while it's still, like, an incredibly emotional scene, and it's super, super well done, I'm very much at the point this many years on where I feel like I need the context for, like, okay, who was Liu Ten? What was that dynamic like? How was Liu Ten with regards to, like, a kind of Fire Nation member of Fire Nation royalty? Was he like Iroh, very much influenced by his father, or maybe was he heading down more of a kind of Ozai path, and that's maybe what got him killed? Like, there's a lot of interesting kind of ideas and things to think about with that. Just it being presented in this way where it sort of orders things is nice enough, but, you know, we need a bit more, I think. Aang era. The Aang era, I think, is the most disappointing one in the whole book. But I also maybe understand why it's like this. Now, I say that, but I'd be more understanding if we didn't have, like, a 3-year gap between the last significant Avatar comic. In that they don't want to say anything else significant that happens in case it gets in the way of maybe what the next comic is about. And then, like I said, the problem is that we don't know what the next comic is. The next Avatar comic that's due to be released is a chibi comic that we don't even know is, like, properly canon or not. And then even if it is canon, it's not going to have anything too significant in it, just because of it's a short book. I think it's only 48 pages. It's been delayed by like a year. Who knows what the situation is? We don't have a confirmation of post-imbalance continuation. So this era is literally just, here's this comic, you can deal with the aftermath of it. Here's this comic, you can deal with the aftermath of that. So it's just like, what if you did a story where you dealt with the New Ozai Society? What if you continued with the Southern Reconstruction Project? Or the start of Bender supremacy from Imbalance? All these plot points that you know about, it makes sense, but we need more. And I'd be more understanding of this if we knew we were just waiting for the next comic, But because it's been so long, like 2 years for the Korra comics, 3 years for the Avatar comics, and getting towards similar times with the novels, it's frustrating that this book has to be one of the more significant releases of the year when it probably shouldn't be. This should just, where Avatar is right now, this should just be like a nice extra that surprisingly added in a lot of Roku information. But instead, this could be the most significant Avatar release of the year, just because every other thing so far on the schedule this year is a short story, which can be a little hit and miss. Some of them, Free Comic Book Day delivered last year, so I'm expecting it to deliver again because it has the same format, one Avatar, one Korra comic. I'm back and forth on if I think Patterns in Time will deliver, just because I thought Team Avatar Tales, the news stories, were not significant at all. But we'll see. I think there's so much ground to cover in Korra, it feels like there's no way you can't, really deliver. So, we'll see what happens. Aang era. What I do like about the Aang era is just sort of this idea. The comics really coming into play here and presenting these characters who feel rather minor and maybe not the most significant as actually being really important characters. That, Jing Ying, Jingbo, and Yi Li are going to be leader characters within the, Air Nation to be, the Air Acolytes. And that's a cool prospect that it makes me really want to see the kind of the time skip stories of seeing the characters when they're older. Not just to see our ATLA cast when they're older, but also to see characters like a Yi Li actually maybe leading the newly rebuilt like Eastern Air Temple or something like that. Those are actually like kind of cool ideas that I do want to see. Because we're dealing with the character when they're very young. There's a lot of kind of fun, odd stuff happening with them. But it'll be nice to see, like, they're leaders within their nation, and that's pretty cool. Water Tribe just covers the stuff from North and South, basically, without going into too much depth. One thing I think overall about the Water Tribes that I wish the book went into a little bit more, and this is more about, I suppose, the early section where it just does like the sort of foundational information. Establishing the feud between the two tribes like in the first place. And in that, I don't think this book does it. I'd have to go back and check, but I don't think it actually mentions what we do, I think, officially know, which is that initially it was just a Northern Water Tribe, and then the South formed by splitting off from it because effectively of the restrictions of the culture and stuff like that. I don't think the book quite says that as like a bit of an origin story, when it maybe should. It's a similar thing with the whole Ba Sing Se, that they never say that the history of Ba Sing Se is that it used to be underground, explaining the catacombs and stuff like that. But anyway, that's fine, Malik. Nakul is the new character here, the story keeper, which is it makes sense for the era to have a character like that, even though they're maybe not the most significant new character. Earth Kingdom is fine. The Beifong Metal Bending Academy, stuff like that. Not too much to say there. Fire Nation. Oh, okay. Here we go. We have to talk about this. Azula. So Azula is obviously one of the more talked about characters in the fandom, just because she has probably the most like significant like story within the comics, in that it's a main character from the show whose arc we actually don't know where it goes, because we never saw the character in Korra, and all that they've been doing across the Avatar comics so far has been building the character to create an arc across a little bit in The Promise, The Search, Smoke and Shadow, and that's where we've left it off. The section here with Azula doesn't say much more than what we already know, in that it says, she disguised herself as a dark spirit in order to manipulate the new Ozai society into attacking Zuko. to make him strong, or so she claims. Despite everything that has happened, Azula may very well care for the welfare of her brother, though their relationship remains tenuous. So they basically say what I think is the obvious speculation from the end of Smoke and Shadow, is that Azula is going to continue to sort of, terrorize the capital, the Fire Nation, and cause Zuko to act in the ways that she thinks the leader of the Fire Nation should act. And like she said in that comic, that's her way of, like, in a way, being the leader, is by forcing Zuko to be the leader she wants to be. It's actually an interesting idea for the story in highlighting Azula's change as a character, but also missing where she actually needs to go as a character. Now, it doesn't mention that, like, her meeting Ursa is probably the most significant plot point, but it's something. It's nice to get it sort of, I think, at least mentioned again, to where, like, Azula feels like in like an official capacity, like, we don't talk about Azula. We don't know what's going on with her story. But it's weird because, like, if one of the main Avatar Studios projects is ATLA a bit further on, are they going to do the Azula story? Or will that have already happened in the background and they are leaving it for the comics to do? That's what I think is kind of confusing, because it feels like they have to do something with the character, and that you can't just leave her as this sort of villain character who's just there the whole time. The arc is there to do maybe not a full redemption, but at least something that resembles a redemption with her, to just change her into a position that makes sense for her for, like, the rest of her life. So there's that. What else do we got here? Some of the newer characters. Nurgui, the assassin character. Again, a lot of this is fine. Korra era. This era, I think, it's all right. I think it's pretty solid the way it's done, in that they give a few little extra pieces. Like, I do actually really like the extra context they give on Eska and Desna as leaders. That feels like it is something that they went into with a little bit more depth than you could immediately, I suppose, just read into from the show. And just highlighting that, oh yeah, like, very young leaders for the North, and actually sort of progressive young leaders for the North. That's going to shake things up a little bit. And even in some of the adventure hooks, they address that dynamic as well. But the era does seem to be mostly defined by book 1, book 2, book 2, book 3. Oh, look, here's book 4. Oh, and the only, like, Avatar comic with, like, a significant plot. It's all of the plots. And it's just, you do the rest. You want to bring the Earth Empire back? Sure, go ahead. You want to bring the Equalists back? Sure. It's just like, okay. Again, it's that idea of, where is our Chenbao in this era? Where's just this sort of place that, let's say, the Fire Nation has just a little political dispute with, like, the Northern Water Tribe over, or something like that. They're just having an argument with the Southern Water Tribe over this one thing. And it would address something that, like, Azumi's dynamic with Eska and Desna, and maybe how it was before with Unalaq. Again, it's more of that idea of, I highlighted in the Roku era stuff that didn't directly involve Roku as the centerpiece character. But here, if Korra is not involved, it might as well have not happened, is sort of the way this comes across in this era. And there's not much of an attempt to do more than that. So that's kind of interesting. Republic City gets its own section, but there's not too much else added on, other than, I suppose you could take this as being somewhat of a clarification on top of the comics, is that, oh, it's not just that Bolin is sticking with the job as Julie's assistant because he kind of likes it. Actually, he does want to go into politics. I don't feel like the comic necessarily full on made that decision. I think it was more speculation that made sense, but they seem to be potentially suggesting that, like, oh yeah, that is the direction Bolin's heading in. And it's definitely needed. How much they'll go into that, I'm not really sure, but it's interesting enough. So there's that. Red Lotus supporters, obviously, is kind of interesting. What else do we got here? Water tribes, like I said, the section on Desna and Eska is quite good. I like that Tonrock and Senna gets mentioned. More Senna content is always good. I'd like to see more of her kind of utilized in stories rather than most of Korra's dynamic being with her father. That's why I like Civil Wars quite a lot. Is that some of those like Korra Senna scenes are actually very, very good. Young leadership is mentioned here. Varric. Korra Earth Kingdom. Yeah, it hits all the kind of beats you'd expect it to. Again, I'll actually mention this here about this and the previous era. I wish Omashu got a mention in Aang's era as well as the Korra era. Especially the Aang era, where I feel like there probably at some point is a significant plot with Omashu, because I'm guessing Bumi, like that Bumi's death, whenever it happens, however long he lives, is going to be a massive kind of point in like Aang's life, because it's like the only person left from like his original era. Like that's a cool plot point. I get it why they don't really go into it. They don't want to say too much, but they also, it's not really mentioned. Like, I'm struggling to remember now. Does Omashu actually get mentioned like ever in Korra? Or am I just forgetting something really, really obvious? Like, I don't think it even gets like specifically dropped as like, oh, this is when Kuvira took it over or anything like that. Am I forgetting something really obvious? It feels like I am, but it might be one of those things where I'm just completely missing it. But nothing immediately springs to mind about Korra era Omashu, but we'll see. So that's that. Okay, so Omashu was mentioned at the train station. Okay, so I got like a name drop, I guess. But nothing like significant, like we didn't see it or anything. That's fine. Oh, that's an interesting point, is that if that's correct, it shows that Kuvira has not taken it over. I have to look at that, because like she obviously highlights that she hasn't taken United Republic. She stuff like that. Yeah, that's something I just need to, I probably need to look into. Either way, I don't think it gets like a substantial one to the point where like in this book they don't mention it. So there's that. Fire Nation section is an unusual section, I think, where they clearly based all these paragraphs off like that one line of Azumi saying that she'll only support the United Republic with like military help if it's like a defensive effort and it won't be an offensive effort. And I get it, like that it has to be sort of the Fire Nation during this era, but it does feel that's about all they have to go on here. Now, it's very obvious that, of course, like outside of like slightly touching on the Fire Nation, in that like that's where Korra washes up on Bonte Island, and then we see Zuko sort of take off from, you know, Ember Island or whatever. We never really like go there and see what it's like in the Korra era, so you have to rely only on what Azumi says. And Azumi's cool and all, but it's like there's so many questions like that revolve around her, of like, one, does her daughter, if that character is fully canon, are they committing to that character being a thing or not? Because it feels like that character should be mentioned if the character's official in any way. The other point here is that Izumi's mother, aka Zuko's wife, aka Mei, doesn't get mentioned here. This feels like a thing where like, why are we still waiting for like confirmation on like Zuko's end game like relationship? It just feels so crazy that we're going 10 years post Korra, and admittedly, like, Zuko's only introduced a little bit later in Korra, but still, it's an awkward situation. Didn't Bright confirm the daughter exists as canon? Where did this come from again? I think it's one of the episode commentaries where they sort of talk about how they had a rough idea that they would have fit in, like, if they had time, that they would have had the cast go to the Fire Nation and meet a character who is Azumi's daughter, and that Mako would have had a plot where he started a relationship with her. I don't think much more about it was said than that. So it's basically, do you read into sort of like, there was an intent to have this as a plot point, but we never got anywhere near it. It's a bit of a weird one. But yeah, the lack of a May drop here is interesting, because, like, why is it still technically, I suppose, a spoiler who Zuko's, like, wife is? So it's so weird. This is where it does stand out that, like, okay, they obviously couldn't have stuff happening. It's awkward. But anyway, Dal Jiro, an interesting idea for the character. Like, this character on their own, I think, helps to probably create, like, a little bit more of the dynamic of the Fire Nation in this era. Just with the idea that they got the support from the Royal Fire Academy for girls to kind of figure out who they were. That, like, can you imagine that happening in certain other eras in the Fire Nation, especially after, like, what Sozin did? There's your show of progress for the Fire Nation, that this character can have this arc happen. So that stuff is, like, pretty well done, I think, for the Fire Nation. But you really do note that they're kind of stretching. I appreciate that they bring up the obvious question with Iroh of, he's in the military, he's high up in the military, but he's also next in line for the throne. Where do they go with that? I like it as a plot point, and they are setting it up that seems to be a direction for his character. It probably won't happen for a while, because Azumi looks like she's going to be a leader for quite a while unless something crazy happens. But again, no mention of him having a sister here, though they don't say he doesn't have a sister. But, you know, whatever. And then here we go. The most random piece of information in the entire book. It's cool, and I really like it, but it feels like the book doesn't have anything else that is just a tidbit of information like this anywhere in the book. It's just, in his 20s, Zuko found a juvenile dragon he named Druk, who shared an ancestry with Ran and Shaw. Over the years, Druk grew up and became Zuko's loyal companion, and the two of them flew around the world together. And then they seem to imply there are probably some other dragons out there, which makes sense if you want to bring the dragons back. Makes a lot of sense. I doubt they're going to do the whole thing where there's just, like, herds of dragons like there were herds of sky bisons to bring them back. This probably is a rarer thing, but there'll be enough to where a few eras on from Korra we will probably see more dragons. I think there's that. So there's that. But what is so interesting about this piece of information is that it seems like they do everything they can not to be overly specific with some of the new information that they present. But this immediately, like, eliminates, it takes out the whole Zuko has a baby dragon plot, that, like, he's told by the Sun Warriors that the thing you touched was a dragon egg, come back here, it's about to hatch, you should probably be the one to bond with it or whatever. It takes out the whole, Zuko training his dragon kind of plot, and instead it's just like, yeah, at some point when he's in his 20s, he just randomly comes across a, teenage dragon or whatever. So you miss the fun aspect of it, and immediately get to the idea that he has, I guess, a mount who can fly him around the world. Still, it's weird because it doesn't completely destroy the theory that the Sun Warrior artifact was the dragon egg. In fact, it borderline, like, adds onto it that it hatches without Zuko being around 10 years pass and then they meet again when they're older. That's actually kind of cool. And it's good to have it here just because like the name Druk, like I think so many people are kind of like, where did the name like initially like even like come from? Like I think, does Zuko say it? I think he says it once. But we knew the dragon's name was Druk before I think he ever said it in the show. And it was like, I think it might have been the old Nickelodeon website that said it or something like that. Because I remember someone asking me that at some point on YouTube, that like, wait, where does the name come from? So like, just them mentioning it again, that it highlights just how little they had ever said before about Zuko having the dragon. He just has it. So there's that. So yeah, and then our art book as well, I think is another place where it happens, because we're getting towards the end here. Like, what else do we have here? Yeah, Air Nation is exactly as presented. They control the portal now. Interesting plot. Would like to see it explored a little bit more. I'll quickly go up to just on that point about like the art book sort of confirming a piece of information. Let's go up to some of this other information that's interesting. Where is it? Okay, here we go. Start of chapter 2. Yes. Yeah, here we go. So yeah, long ago, humans and spirits inhabited separate realms, but then two primordial spirits, Rav and Vatu, pierced the barrier separating them, allowing spirits to enter the physical world. So this was always a bit of a weird plot point, because within the show, it's Vatu on his own who says at this point, it's just like, it was me who like separated the plane of the physical and spirit world. The art book, I think, was the thing to clarify, book 2 art book, to clarify that it was actually the two of them together that did it. And it makes sense, again, because look how Korra created the portal, so it would make sense that these two spirits, like, clashing at a time when there isn't the portal, actually creates the two spirit portals in the first place. Back at, like, the first fight of harmonic convergence, however you imagine that being. So it's just a cool little point, again, clarified here. I won't go into this stuff about like the adventures or the adventure hooks, other than to just note that there's a few little bits, like they name drop a character or two that like you've never heard that name before, but they don't say much about them. There's stuff like the Scarlet Sword triad gets mentioned for the Korra era. There's the fun Korra era plot about the Water Tribe wedding. That kind of seems like a kind of fun idea. Eska and Desna being there. There's some decent stuff if you view it there, because I think they basically said on the Discord that, if it's information like that, you are kind of basically meant to interpret it as being canon, because the whole book went through approvals. So once it's not like a player character being said to have done something, like, it is sort of meant to be canon. So yeah, I think that's most of what I want to talk about for this specific section of the video. So let's swap these titles around to this and do our second topic here. So this is Avatar Legend RPG bending discussion. Now, it's not hyper focused on the Legends RPG. It's basically just one section of it that I do want to dive into a little bit, because I find it interesting the way it's worded. So we'll go into that now, and then we'll do a little bit of a fun thing in relation to it. So here is the page for this section. Here you go. Specialized bending. So this is in chapter 7, so it's way past the initial settings chapter. But again, just randomly in the middle of them talking about game mechanics and how advancement works, there is this section that seems to just be, we'll go about the settings for a section and actually explain specialized bending. So here's what it says. There are some forms of bending that are so specialized, only a small subsection of benders can even perform them. Earthbenders can all bend rocks, but even in the Korra era, not all earthbenders can also bend metal. Waterbenders can all bend a stream, but only a small portion of them have the training and the aptitude to bloodbend. Thank goodness. These specialized bending forms aren't unique abilities. gifted only to a few special characters, but they are extremely difficult to master. In many cases, some benders find so little aptitude for a given form, like metal bending, that they're unable to ever learn to do it. In most cases, however, these specialized forms are an expansion of a bender's natural abilities, not new abilities altogether. So when I read this the first time, I was kind of like, whoa, that kind of reads like a mess of kind of contradictions, and that like you're saying the characters are special, but then certain characters have no aptitude for it, so that a rare technique means a character does have high aptitude for it, so they are sort of special. And then if it's rare enough that only like 2 people have it, then it basically is effectively, you know, rare or whatever. It reads like I get what they're going for, but they're trying to be very general and broad, that it leaves a few kind of like situations where I'm just thinking like, what are they going for here? So I think the core point they're trying to make here with this statement here, these specialized bending forms aren't unique abilities, is that they're basically getting across, don't view lava bending as just being lava bending. It's still an earth bending technique at its core. There's no fire bending involved or anything like that. It's just a high level earth bending technique. Now, I think the chat already knows kind of the general idea of where I'm going to go with this. So it basically is trying to create the idea of, okay, aptitude is what separates being able to do it versus not being able to do it. Now, what do they mean by aptitude? Because, again, they seem to be using this as the sort of like get out of jail free card here, with just like whatever that means. I think what they're basically trying to say with aptitude is it is a combination of, one, do you have actual formal training? Do you know on a technical level how to use that ability? Did anyone teach you it? 2, there's some sense of like, how good are you at actually like learning things full stop? And then 3, which is more of the, I suppose, technical point, on a physical level, how powerful of a bender are you in terms of like your raw potential from birth? That last point, I think, is ultimately what they're trying to say, without really going into it like too much. That aptitude does come down to effectively you are a naturally high-powered bender early on, so that means you are more likely to be able to learn this technique going forward. Now, it seems to open the door to situations like what they're saying here is that combustion bending is like a learnable ability. Now, I still think there's like crazy restrictions in place for it, and that not any firebender can just go out and learn combustion bending for a variety of reasons. One, there's no one to teach it. The 2 characters who have combustion bending are both dead. And like within the context of this game, the only era where there would be a combustion bending teacher is the 100-Year War era. And I don't think Combustion Man would be a particularly great teacher, given what he did to his arm and leg. Not to mention, like, we don't know how those 2 characters playing Combustion Man even learned their own ability, let alone how they both realized they needed to put a tattoo on their forehead to focus their chakra at that specific chakra point, and that whole thing. There's a lot of that stuff that is just kind of like, whoa, what's going on here? So let's read into some of this other stuff over here. They do at the top of this page go on to explain that, like, effectively these specialized forms, the people who know them are cautious about teaching them to other people because they are so dangerous and they could cause a lot of harm. That's one thing. The bloodbending section, I think, is interesting because I think it basically gets into the point I'm going to make now in a minute. Waterbenders who have mastered bloodbending can bend the water inside a target's blood, contorting their limbs, cutting off circulation, even forcing target to move in a certain way. In most cases, bloodbending requires something to boost the waterbender's abilities, such as the full moon. So immediately they're saying, you can boost your abilities to the point where you can use bloodbending without needing the full moon. Where do we know something like that happened before? Well, it's a family. Yakone, Noatok, and Tarlok were all born naturally boosted, able to do this at will. And I think that's the point that's sort of being made here, that, like, say, the aptitude of those three particular characters is exceptionally high because they're naturally incredibly powerful waterbenders. Now, I'll bring in some quotes here while I have it. I actually have this open here. Where is it here? So K111, skeletons in the closet. Tarlok explains the stuff. My father was once a bloodbender of rare skill. Yakone himself says about his family, our family has the strongest line of bloodbenders in history. Bloodbenders of the highest order. Tarlok explains the training process behind this, which is that they did start by using the full moon to assist them, but he then taught us how to bloodbend anytime without the need of the full moon. Then they go on and explain that the technique sort of beyond that, the top level bloodbending technique is psychic bloodbending, not needing to use your hands or anything like that. So that's an interesting kind of point there, in that they do open the door to that with bloodbending, that they say that this technique requires enhancement effectively to do. That it's not typically something that you can just do at will, except for that specific group of families. Now, the family seems to be a direct contradiction to maybe the point that they're trying to make here, which is that, gifted only to a special few characters. Well, it certainly seems like that family is gifted to kind of be like that. Let's see. Do people think bloodbending family is related to Hama? I'd ultimately say no. I think it's just a case that Hama is a very talented waterbender, and it's basically implied to be the best of her generation. And she just happened to be in a position where everything aligned and she thought of a different way to use waterbending and it happened. I think that's a very different situation than, say, the Yakone family realizing, whoa, we can do this ability without needing to use the full moon, and just developing that through Yakone, and then him focus training his children to do that. So that's cool. And then for anyone wondering, other forms of bending enhancement are also stuff like spirit enhancement, which is basically what the Avatar state is, from the Kyoshi novels. Yoon eating glowworm, spirit enhancement, that sort of thing. That's other ways to boost bending. That's what the comet does as well. So you get these ideas of, like, well, I'd also put combustion bending in the category where that you would say, like, typically this ability needs a boost to be able to use. So that Combustion Man and Pali have that kind of boost built in. But under the comet, if you do the training, you probably can do combustion bending. An Avatar, if they spend enough time in the Avatar state and do the training required to do the specific technique of combustion bending, should they be able to actually learn combustion bending? If all the limit effectively comes down to is that you are powerful enough to perform this technique. Otherwise, they're creating this weird dynamic where a specific technique, which is still part of the same bending family, like, requires a very just specific, undefined aptitude for it. But we'll get into that again in a second. Healing. I like the description here of it, just like they say, use water to redirect and concentrate energy within a person. I like that they clarify that. Lava bending, change the phase of Earth from solid to liquid and back again, as well as control Earth in both solid and liquid forms. So that's actually interesting. The addition there at the end of, like, liquid Earth bending, which is, I guess, are they saying that, like, liquid Earth is just like magma lava, or are they trying to get into the idea of that? Because, like, Yoon basically does, like, liquid earth bending without turning it into magma. But I guess that maybe is a slightly different technique. But on the pathway to that. I'm not sure. Lightning bending, they also get across, separating positive and negative energies. And again, the main thing to note just about some of these things is that there is also a unique aspect to some of these techniques as well. That it's not just, I'm using my bending to do something with water. Like, healing requires you to specifically know stuff about chi paths. Lightning requires you to separate energy in a very specific way that is unrelated to like other kind of aspects of bending, and so on. Like, combustion bending requires you, I guess, to have a little bit more knowledge about sort of chi paths and chakras as well, which is another sort of like requirement in a way on top of that. So there's that. And yeah, and again, note that in this official description, they don't mention like firebending as being involved in lava bending at all, because just to address this, even though I've done it before, even though it feels like, there's a few examples that sort of fit the idea that lava bending requires firebending heritage. The reality of that is that if you take that as being the case, you then have to say that like all water benders have firebending heritage because they can change the phase of water, which is technically related to heat. But the reality of this is that it's actually just the sort of bending magic that's doing it rather than heat, even though I guess it's still, the science is still happening kind of type thing there. They're just trying to say that sort of earth bending taken to its peak is able to do these phase changes without issue. Seismic sense is mentioned here, spirit bending is mentioned here, and then just note that again, they use the same wording, redirect and alter the flow, but for a spirit compared to healing, which is for a physical body. Just that same concept, just done on two different things. That's pretty nice. The way they do it in the game, just to, I suppose, go a little bit in on this, is that when you make your character, you can choose to have your character start off with a mastered metal bending skill or a mastered combustion bending skill. So you effectively create your character as already having the special ability that you want. So then you ignore having to actually learn it over the course of your campaign or whatever. But if you do want your character to have to learn these skills, they effectively say that you do like an aptitude roll when you meet the trainer for that skill, and you start off with a -1 or potentially more. And if you fail, like if you completely fail that roll to try and learn an ability, you are treated in the game as not having the aptitude at all for that skill and can never learn it, even if you go to a different master of that same ability. So that is, quite interesting. I actually like that they incorporated that into the game, that, not everyone's going to be the super special bender who gets all the special techniques. The idea that you miss your roll with like 2 key characters and you don't get metal bending or lava bending, that's interesting. So that's sort of cool. So yeah, there's that. Let's see, what are we discussing here in the chat? Airbending has no special techniques. I suppose this gets into the breakdown that I typically do for bending techniques, which is that it obviously not every element has an example of this, but I think the idea ultimately is that we'll get there. Every element has sort of a technique you can learn under the right conditions, but you shouldn't necessarily be locked out of it because you're not a special, super enhanced bender. They each have a spiritual technique that you need to be spiritual to perform, and then each of them, I think, probably do have a rare, you have to be born with it, it's a very special ability. So the idea here would be, say, something like you have, like, bloodbending without the full moon is the rare ability for water. You have the spiritual ability for water, which is sort of like healing / spirit bending, which are kind of similar things ultimately. But then you also have that, like, if you really, kind of try, most people should be able to learn something like, they seem to imply like healing and is something that you can learn if you try, if there's the right kind of training in place, but also that when the moon comes out, you can potentially learn that as well. But earthbending probably has a better example in that. I'll bring up the dialogue here. Where is it? From book 3 and 4. Bo Lin and his whole plot to learn metal bending. The information he has says that only like 1 earthbender in 100 can metal bend, but Su Yin and then later Toph both say that effectively don't believe what you hear other people say. Like, my experience is that most people, if they put their mind to it and have the right attitude, can learn metal bending. So they seem to create the idea that techniques like, say, metal bending or lightning, if you have someone to teach you and you get good teaching and you are in any way a reasonable bender and you put the time in, you should be able to learn that technique. Again, there still seems to be a sense for like you probably have to have some aptitude for it. If you're just a weak bender, you're probably never going to get there. But most reasonable characters, like say a Bo Lin, they effectively say here if he tries, should be able to learn metal bending, because this dialogue in book 4 goes on to kind of cover the idea that like, he says to Toph, like, I did learn how to lava bend. It's a very rare ability. And Toph considers him like talented for having that ability. And they've never like confirmed in a way that, you know, Bo Lin can't learn metal bending. Again, it gets into that idea. It's probably tricky in that even though it is still an earthbending technique, it is a different like form of it, and you have to do it in a very different way because it suddenly involves controlling the phase. Like lava involves controlling the phase of the earth. There's a lot more sort of, I suppose, danger just naturally involved with doing it, and you need to have much more control over it. And then there's the obvious idea of, compared to normal earthbending, lava is like the complete opposite because you're effectively almost, you know, doing kind of almost water bending style things in a way because it's liquid. So there's that. But yeah, it creates the idea that one of the gaps in the sort of lineup of bending abilities would be, what is the rare ability for air? What's the you have to be born with an ability for air? That's the equivalent of lava and combustion and like psychic blood bending. Like everyone always goes for the idea of either like sound bending, like using it to create like sonic booms or something like that, or maybe going more heavy in on the whole kind of vacuum maybe style thing. It's interesting. Some of the stuff that's presented. As for the other quotes that I have here, this is just the direct quote from Sokka from Out of the Past 109 that literally confirms, I guess, the idea that, yeah, there are people born with rare and unique bending abilities. Yakone, they confirm here, is one of these unique benders. That in the Korra era, I guess it's just that era where they're beginning to realize that in terms of sort of categorization, they are beginning to realize that, yeah, some people do just like are born naturally gifted benders who have the capacity to do some crazy things because they are basically born, naturally kind of super boosted to be able to do these other things. What else do I have here? Iroh about firebending, lightning specifically, says only a select few firebenders can separate these energies, so you need to be somewhat talented to do it. But notably, he considers Zuko talented enough that he should be able to do it. And given that he can redirect, there's the implication that even though we don't know it yet, he will eventually someday be able to generate lightning, even though we've never seen it happen. And then Zhang about healing says people of the tribes sometimes have this ability. This one's a little bit weird, because then when we go to the Northern Water Tribe a few episodes later, they seem to imply that all like female waterbenders can learn healing. Now, it probably still is the case that not all of them have the ability, but that because the training there is so good, they can get even not hyper-skilled waterbenders to get this ability. Which all leads to, I suppose, what I want to do here is just kind of talk about those sort of those gaps, what they're talking about with regards to like aptitude, like what levels you actually need to be at, and just a little bit of a fun thing. Let's put some numbers on it. So I just created a little bit of this, a bit of a table to try and just have a bit of fun here with chat and see where you guys stand on the the numbers and so on. So if we say that the effective requirements are going to be like your bending skill, and we separate that into sort of bending power, as in the scale, how big you can go, raw power, and then bending precision, which is also important because what is the key trait of like metal bending is that you need to be precise. You can have all the power in the world, but if you can't see the earth in the metal, you can't do it. And then there's a clear implication that a lot of these special techniques require the sort of delicate touch as well as the power to perform them as well. So it's a nice sort of, complement to have these two together. And then certain abilities might have an extra thing added onto them as well, that you need to have this as well as something else. So if you view the avatar state as being the complete 100 out of 100 in every category, and then because it's not really like, we're not talking about like being able to get there, but more like defining the end of the power scale, it also basically means you're hyper spiritual as well. So you've already hit the point where like any spiritual requirement for doing abilities is kind of unlocked already. And then you get into the actual limitations. Combustion bending. Like, basically, why can a character like Iroh, why can't he combustion bend, even though we view him as being one of the most powerful firebenders in the world? If what the game is saying is true to take from a full canon perspective and treat it as, theoretically someday, someone will go from not being naturally born with combustion bending, but rather actually go on and learn it, is it that even possible? So, can Iroh learn it if he tried? Or does he not have the aptitude? Is he a bit behind? So, I tried to just sort of create, again, the numbers, I didn't put too much thought into these numbers. I just tried to make it roughly in line with each other. So if you say with combustion bending, you need to have 93 out of 100 bending power, maybe only 87 precision. What if Iroh, what if his stats are like, he has, say, like 88 power and like 90 precision? So he actually has the precision requirements met, but he doesn't quite have the power because it's an ability that kind of goes into the upper kind of echelons of like that. Above 90 is in the sort of like enhanced tier, basically. So your standard benders are probably looking at having like 90 as being the top stat you can have unless you're enhanced in some way. So there's an idea of like, oh, that's why Iroh can't ever do combustion bending, because he's not quite powerful enough and kind of never will. He probably knows enough about like chi energy from his skill as a lightning bender to be able to harness and perform the technique if he could do it. But then there's also the whole idea that the two combustion benders that we have are both incredibly tall people. Now, is that just a coincidence, or is it like a thing that like you only have combustion bending if you're like 7 foot tall? Because an aspect of the ability is that you're probably going to send yourself flying backwards unless you really ground yourself. So there's sort of another requirement. Lava bending, I wasn't really sure what to go with this one. I just said gave it the sort of standard 90 because it seems like it's an ability that requires big power, big precision, but maybe not like excessively so into the super high territories. So then you, with lava bending, you sort of create the idea of, okay. Why can Toph metal bend, but not lava bend? And there's that interesting point of like, what stats does Toph have that would keep her out of this? And it's probably literally a case where, kind of like the Iroh example, like Toph is probably like, let's say 89 power or something like that. Maybe actually has like 91 or 2 precision, but is just a little bit off in some category or another from being able to do lava bending. But she more than meets the requirements for, say, metal bending, which maybe they're a little high, the way I have them there up at 80, or maybe they should be more like 75. It depends on, I suppose, where you would clarify your like average bender at being if you were to use this sort of scoring system, and what character you consider to be your like average bender in terms of like, I suppose based on this scale in chat, what scores would you give, say, Haru? Like just a character who you say is decent. He's like better than your average like Earthbender guard, but he's never going to be anything wildly like special. What's Haru's power? What's Haru's precision in comparison to these things? To where Haru is probably like a character who can maybe just about metal bend. Like if he really put the time and work in and devoted himself to it, Haru probably should be there and thereabouts for metal bending. So it creates this distinction of like, so is the cutoff for metal bending actually more down at like the 70s or something like that? So like that's another kind of interesting point. 50-55 for Haru. That's interesting. I guess it depends on how you use the scale and where you determine it. In that, like, I guess like 0-0 is like non-bender. Like a child bender, I guess, is where you do the like 10s, 20s, 30s. It's tough. Again, everyone's going to view the numbers a little bit differently, but I think you guys get the point that I'm sort of trying to make here of maybe this is why like you have situations like Boomy. Boomy definitely meets the capacity to learn metal bending. He probably just hasn't tried. And that if Toph offered to teach him, he could probably do it because he's skilled enough. And so there's an example of a character who is like more than powerful enough to do it, but he just hasn't tried. And then you beg the question of like, Boomy's probably powerful enough where he's maybe close-ish to lava bending, but he probably misses out for like the reverse reasons of Toph, where like he probably has crazy bending power, but maybe his precision is a little bit off. And again, you have situations like, again, I consider metal and lightning bending to be like the equivalent skill for each of those elements. Spirit bending, I just said because it's more spiritual focused, that like it probably doesn't require a ton of power, but you still need to be able to, I suppose, effectively like overpower a spirit to actually balance them. But it's more the precision that you need to do it. But it also has the extra capacity of you need high spirituality. And then I said like, oh, what if Boomy's like 92-85? That would allow him to do metal bending, but not lava bending. Let's say a character like Yoon, pre and post enhancement, like let's say Yoon, who was described as not having anywhere near the power of Kyoshi beforehand, but still being very, very skilled, but mainly for precision purposes. Big precision score, maybe, good, but not like stunning power. But then enhanced, he probably goes up to close to Avatar state bending. And I was like, do you give him 100 out of 100, but just specify only earth bending, or just a little bit below? And where is that scale? Again, we could spend hours here perfecting this and making it so that it works for everything. It's just an example to try and create the idea of like, when they say aptitude, what is really meant, I suppose. So let's say, let's just put, say, like Haru here. Let's say, like, just normally, he's like sort of 75-75. He's just your, like, middle-of-the-road bender who is notable, but not anything fancy. And then you'd sort of say, like, he can maybe go sort of, like, say, +5. He can maybe do +5 with training, with specific training. Like if Toph and her metal bending students all focused on teaching Haru earth bending for a long amount of time, that he probably could improve his skills to reach that kind of metal bending cap. And so there's still room for like kind of growth within this system to a point. When you have sort of characters like, say, Boomy. Boomy's probably locked at 92. He's probably not getting higher than that, no matter what he does. But because Haru, we know him, he's still a relatively young character who, I guess, was trained by his father, but we don't really know if his father had specifically fancy training. So he might be just growing his normal skills naturally by getting training from highly skilled benders like that. So there's those factors to keep in as well, of like the likes of Iroh, Bumi, and so on, are characters who have had complete training and have sort of training plus, because they are masters. They're part of an Order of White Lotus where like they share knowledge from the nations. I guess they discuss bending. Iroh trained with the masters, so he has enhanced training there. So there's those kind of things to factor in as well. Now, there's probably weird situations of, like, say, let's use Bolin as the example. How does Bolin work in terms of he can lava bend, but he can't metal bend? But everything the show says tells us if you put the time in, you can metal bend. So the idea is that Bolin has to have at least these stats. Because he's still young, he might not come across as actually having better stats than, say, X character or Y character, but he meets the conditions to perform a technique that someone else can't. And the idea is that, I guess, the understanding here is that, kind of like we saw if we bring Sun in from Toph Beifong's Metal Bending Academy, look at the way he lava bent. When he got into tough situations into the fight and he was getting a little bit more emotional, his earthbending just turned into lava. It didn't seem like he was able to control it as such. It was just, he's going for an earthbending attack, but because he's doing it like aggressively, emotionally, putting the power in, it becomes lava. That he's putting a power in that is at the level the other characters don't have. So there's that sort of interesting idea. And then, so Bolin can put that like just power in because lava bending doesn't require amazing technical knowledge, whereas metal bending actually does. In the sense that, like, again, you have to focus in on what's in the metal. Now, I think if Bolin spent the time, I absolutely think Bolin will be able to sense the earth in the metal, because if there's anything that Bolin is good at, it's being a precision bender. Look at how good he is in pro bending, which requires more precision than power. He's the one to fire the shot at Peli in the fight to target her accurately. There's no way Bolin shouldn't be able to do metal bending. The problem is, it's maybe a situation where he's got a busy life. He's trying to develop the technique he can already do. Does he also now need to develop this other technique that might actually take quite a while for him to do, even though he can do it? So there's that point as well, is that even though it is an earthbending technique, it still requires a bigger learning and so on. Yes, now is a good time to join. We're basically moved on from the RPG book, and we're overall just talking about sort of bending effectively. So no real things about that. Yeah, and like that is the point, obviously, to bring up with all of this stuff of like the creators don't think about it this deeply, but there's enough there to where I think you can still make it work. Like, I don't think any of this is going wildly like out of control here. Again, will they ever clarify like stats on bending for characters? I don't think they will. This is just a fun exercise to help to explain what they were maybe saying in that section in the book. Interesting point. Is precision in aim and precision in detecting the particles of Earth the same, though? Yes and no. They're obviously two different things, but they would ultimately both fall under the category of using your bending in a precise way. One is controlling a stone accurately enough to hit something with a target. The other is focusing your bending on a piece of earth within metal. So I think that's the sort of point here. So that makes sense, I think. But yeah, like, again, we're not going to go through all the characters here, unless there's specific characters you guys want to like have the discussion about, like what numbers they would have and so on. I think that's the point and so on that was made. But yeah, Bolin's arc is weird, just because like his arc doesn't seem to involve him necessarily even needing to use his bending all that much. So his arc always feels weird, that like he's basically one of the most powerful benders in the world, technically, just because he has this ability, but he's probably not going to be able to use it that much. But, you know, he's always going to be involved with Team Avatar, so there's that. Yeah. And again, like the point, again, I suppose getting into the hybrid bending thing, it gets confusing, and I think I've talked about it before, because you're getting into the point where one of the most hard and steadfast rules in the lore from beginnings is that every bender can only have one element. They break that rule for the Avatar by an incredible, well explained, but a sequence of events that are very difficult to make happen again. And that's the only way where you can end up with having multiple elements. So the idea that you can sort of have like a partial element within you is kind of weird, and like maybe doesn't make too much sense. Again, this is getting sort of technical on another level, because the second you introduce one hybrid ability, you have to introduce them all, basically. And then, like, what are they? Yeah, what's the air-water ability? What's the water-earth ability? And you just keep going, like, on and on to try and find them. And we're basically getting into sort of Naruto Kekkei Genkai thing, where, like, it's just these combinations. And then immediately people are going to start asking, well, if every hybrid ability is on the option, what about the triple abilities? What about them? And we get into the really sort of wild stuff of, like, you know, all four elements together, which effectively is like bubbly hot dirt bending, according to that episode, obviously. So it's an interesting one, like, because it's obviously one of the more well-known theories in the whole fandom is the whole lava bending has a bit of fire involved in it. And I think even the creators probably were thinking that was the case, because Zito, when we see him lava bend in the show, it's demonstrating avatars using the avatar state. He's the fire avatar, and they demonstrate him using lava bending. So it's obviously a case where, like, back then, start of book 2, still early on in the franchise, I think they probably considered lava bending a fire ability until I think they got more towards the end of, like, book 3 and stuff like that. And they got to a situation where you had, like, Roku and Sozin on the mountain fighting the volcano, and you specifically show Roku being able to lava bend, more so because he's the avatar, and Sozin instead is the one, like, doing the heat kind of redirection ability, the kind of sucking heat out of things and sending it off into the air. And even that's kind of relatively unconfirmed. This game, in Roku's Legends NPC thing, seems to confirm that just Roku's a natural lava bender, but it's unclear about, like, if they incorporate lava bending into that at all. Because, again, if we use this system, the avatar, when they use the avatar state, should be able to use more or less any technique that a avatar has learned at some point. So the idea would be that future avatars past Korra, when they go into the avatar state, should be able to use metal bending no problem in the avatar state. And then because there's been previous lava bending avatars, that's why it is now sort of on the menu. So will any avatar ever incorporate combustion bending in, like, the learning of this skill? Because the reason it probably can't happen right now is just because no avatars maybe learned the ability, even though they have the stats maybe to pull it off. But, you know, interesting stuff overall. Oh yeah, we got a waterbender paint bending in the book. So yeah, it's just they're each focusing on different parts of the material to accomplish like the same thing effectively. That's kind of cool. Aang never learned to metal bend, according to Su Yin. Yeah, and that's interesting because it gets into the idea of like, obviously Avatar in the Avatar state has this, but that is a different stat than I suppose the Avatar not using the Avatar state. Where all of the avatars would have their own unique like stats, I suppose, in that Kyoshi, they establish, effectively has like a unique power level in her earthbending, but actually has sort of almost like a weakness with her precision, which she gets over with training, and she has to use like the fans to assist with that, and I suppose that's something that with training she probably manages to make up for later on. But again, there's Kyoshi is more known as a power bender rather than a precision bender, but probably doesn't have super low precision stats ultimately. Oh yeah, and that gets into the idea of like what how much has been lost with the loss of the past lives. Can the Avatar state not do as much now because a lot of them are gone? It's an interesting one to consider, because you do have to factor in that like Korra still remembers experiences of using the Avatar state where she did have access to those abilities, and does that mean anything, and so on. So it's an interesting one. But the other point is just that when you go into the Avatar state, you're at 100, with all 4 elements. Would you not just use the 4 normal elements that you know super well, rather than needing to go like almost like drop down and use these other abilities? And it gets into that whole idea of like, everyone freaked out about glass bending when it was introduced in Kyoshi, and like, that's such a cool ability. When I play the game, I'm going to be a glass bender. And it's just like, why would you want to be like in combat? Like, what does glass bending do for you that like earth bending isn't going to do for you? It's a cool skill if you want to be like a craftsman, I suppose, in the game. And there are some cool applications for glass, just because I suppose it's something different. But most of what you could do with glass bending, you theoretically can do with normal earth bending in combat to the same degree. So like, it's this technique that requires like all this sort of training and focus to accomplish, to not kind of get you as much. So it's kind of interesting. Because like, okay, like cool, you can shatter glass, but like you can basically earthbend to make shattered pieces of stone and rock that are like just as sharp. So, again, there's the whole craftsman aspect that's kind of good, but, can you imagine the glass specialist only fights with glass, just putting up a glass wall to block these giant rock attacks, and just like, it's just the sound of glass shattering like all throughout the fight, because it's so kind of like brittle compared to normal earth. It's just there's a cool factor to that, obviously, but there's also just funny that like their opponent would probably be just like, why did you not just block that with earth? There's no need to put up a glass wall to block that attack. But there's a use for all forms of bending. There's probably some clever way to incorporate it into combat and so on. So there's so many like cool discussions to have about bending, of course. Because yeah, I guess like Korra has metal bending, Korra has spirit bending, so they'll be sort of passed on to future avatars, and so on. It is kind of cool. Aang Earth minigun from the Ozai fight. Yeah, like there's the demonstration of like the top level bending skills of just like kind of like earth compression, like water compression, like things that you just can't do normally, but that like the Avatar state does allow you to do. But yeah, it's cool. And again, like the reason I went into this again is to help to explain. Basically just explain this kind of text and what it's sort of trying to say, what they mean by aptitude for bending and stuff like that. And if anyone is trying to play the game, I think, almost treating it in terms of like stats is a reasonable way to kind of consider it in a way from like a lore perspective of like, if you don't want all your characters to be the full group of characters to all be special benders by the end of the game, like just kind of maybe ask them to set up like what like power range do you see your character as being. Some characters when they play the game might just want to be a sort of mid-range bender. Some people might want to be like future best in the world at this element, and so kind of just to have in your mind where everything sort of stands up against each other is kind of a cool kind of perspective to have. But ultimately, do I think that section in the book says all that much in terms of confirming that you can go on to learn combustion bending? I don't know. Not really. I suppose just in chat, like looking at that section of the book, because I saw some people on like the Discord take away the learning from that as being, well, I guess this confirms that like combustion bending is not like an ability you sort of have to be born with, which is sort of what it's saying. But I still think it also effectively says you have to be born with the aptitude for it, which for combustion bending is an extremely high like level. So it is effectively a skill you have to be born with, because to get to the level of bending needed to perform combustion bending, you need to be born naturally powerful and then train up to a certain degree. But what are your guys' thoughts overall on what this actually says about the sort of the learning of these special abilities? That was the main interesting thing I thought coming out of this, was just what we take from this. Will Korra ever learn lightning? Well, I suppose who could teach her? Like Mako could teach her, Iroh could teach her. Like Korra is a really skilled bender. She is. I maybe just think that perhaps the technical aspect that is needed with lightning, of like to, carefully separate the energies and stuff like that, is probably something she can get eventually. But it maybe isn't an ability that like is kind of suited to her style as such. Lightning feels like a very Mako ability, and I think it maybe doesn't feel like a Korra ability, whereas like other ones might. Like I think if Korra had the capacity to learn lava, that'd be a really cool extra thing to add on to her, but Bolin already has it. So I don't know, it's an interesting one, definitely. Learn redirection, I think she probably should learn that at some point. Definitely, that's a good idea. Yeah, that's probably the thing. Like story wise, she already has all the abilities. But she definitely has the stats, I think, to do it ultimately. It's probably more of a personality thing. In a way similar to Zuko, why Zuko tends to seemingly struggle with generating lightning, is probably the same reason for Korra in a way. There's that. And that, like, if Korra could learn combustion bending, like, I don't know, does that fit for Korra? Maybe. But again, that's the thing with that ability, is like I find it so difficult to picture a character with combustion bending who isn't like someone who is like 7 foot tall, has like a mysterious origin from some sort of like crazy fire island or something like that. But there, okay. Bye, Antoine. Thanks for joining the stream. And yeah, I think I'll probably be kind of wrapping this up like any minute now anyway as well. So any final questions, I suppose, to anyone to kind of get them in now before I wrap things up as well. Other than that, like stuff like next stream, again, it's going to depend on like stuff happening. The Wan Shi Tong Adventure Guide, like another aspect of this, will be coming out, but we'll see what information's in it and so on. I think the conclusion that most people are coming to with combustion is that it says so little extra about it that I don't think their view of like you can learn these abilities says too much about it. in the sense that, like, yeah, often a third eye tattoo on the forehead, and it's like the two we know have it, but like, why did they know to put it there? Who told them to do that? Because like Combustion Man does not seem like the sort of guy who thinks to himself like, oh, I just learned I had this ability. I blew my arm and my leg off. Do you know what I need to do? I need to get a head tattoo to focus my chi through my forehead so I can better control my ability. It feels like someone would have to like come to him and explain to him that, okay, here's the problem with this. Pali, you can maybe sort of understand that, like, okay, part of the Red Lotus, or like whatever fire island she was on, that kind of backstory that she had, someone somewhere told her something like this. But there's so much more with combustion bending that needs to be explained. There's some sort of a thing where, like, it feels like some Fire Nation tribe somewhere on an island has specific information related to the technique. Definitely. So there's that. Yeah, Combustion Man didn't come out too well from the way we talked about him right now, but he needs more character development. Well, he probably should have been included as a character in the 100-Year War era, and have him be like properly fleshed out. That clarify, like, no, he's actually super smart. He just is silent when he fights or something like that, and happens to have a kind of rather blunt ability or something. Let's see, I think the role-playing game book is great. It's just a lack of other material that leaves lore-seeking people craving for more. It's not the book's fault. It's not meant to explain everything. Ultimately, yeah, like that's why I wouldn't be like highly critical of the book for where it's maybe lacking information. I think some criticism of it for odd choices of when they do include information and then don't include it in this other place, which seems much more like valid to include information. That, I think, criticism is sort of correct, where it's like, if it feels somewhat inexcusable that like they don't name like half of the world leaders for Kyoshi's era, that sort of stuff. But yeah, like I wouldn't be taking like massive points off this book just because the other eras don't go all out with what it did, definitely. But, again, the review is from the lore perspective, and it 7, I think, is fine. There's that. But yeah, I think that's basically everything. So, like I said before, does anyone have any sort of final like topics, final questions before I wrap up the stream? So yeah, just put them in chat if you have any final things you want to mention. Otherwise, I think we covered everything pretty well. We did a kind of run through of the lore in the book again. Interesting enough bending discussion and stuff like that. Okay, where would you rank plant bending? Is it basically bending water in vines? What's so simpler about this than blood bending? Yeah, okay. So I suppose this is more of a what sort of numbers are we talking about for, say, like plant bending? I wouldn't say it requires like too high in terms of like power. I'd say probably relatively low. I wouldn't say you need a ton of power to do plant bending. It's probably more that you maybe need like at least like say like maybe a 70 precision or something like that for plant bending. In that, like, it's specialized to a degree, but the idea seems to be that like you can learn it relatively easily. That it's the initial first sort of pathway to the idea of what blood bending is. In that, I guess you're bending structures that aren't as complicated as like an entire person. So, but it's still the core of it. But again, I think there's a difference between, say, just normal plant bending and even the likes of, like, say, what Hugh does with the whole swamp monster thing. Like, that feels like a signature like technique of plant bending that probably actually requires like, you to be really actually like skilled, and like it requires a bit more versus say like the initial stuff that like say like Hama teaches Katara of just say taking the water out of a plant is not like, it's a subtle technique, but it's probably not like massively complicated to do. But you probably do need like a lot of time, effort, and numbers in your stats to get to be a good plant bender. But yeah, overall, it definitely, you can see where bloodbending stems from. As a speculation, what do you think could be some future airbending specialities other than sound? Yeah, it gets very difficult here because say we didn't know lightning was the extension of firebending. Would we immediately think that, oh, firebenders should be able to bend like lightning or something if they didn't confirm that relatively early in the series? I don't think we necessarily would as such. Maybe you'd get there eventually, but air, like, yeah, sound, the sonic boom, vacuum, anything else? I'm not actually sure. Yeah, like that is an interesting one. It probably is leaning very heavy into weather manipulation. Like it probably, like if you become a master at like just using airbending to sort of manipulate the weather in some way. But again, like we sort of saw, that's maybe water and air together doing it. But I don't know. If you were, you have to consider the idea of like, because this would be a special airbending technique, you're probably talking like 1990 at least, so you can do crazy things with your airbending beyond what we've ever seen. So like was mentioned there, did Kelsang do something like that? He did. Like he basically made a typhoon himself. But I think like Brittany in chat there was mentioning, like, could you take airbending to make more than just the obvious sort of giant air tornado? Can you actually do like maybe other things in the weather that really do sort of properly like change the environment? I'm not sure. It probably maybe feels like a thing where like you'd need a water and an airbender together doing really, really crazy bending to make that happen. But other than that, it's hard to say. I really do think probably like the sound makes a lot of sense ultimately. And then yeah, it could even be something spiritual on like a different level as well that we might not even really be able to like consider as such. What else? Like I can maybe think of something like we've seen Aang at times do the whole sort of like aerodynamics things, or just like, going super fast. What if you could like take that to some sort of like crazy level where like you airbend yourself to like increase the oxygen in your blood or something? Like you do something really crazy like that, and it just like is this sort of like natural enhancement or something like that. Maybe stemming off the whole idea of airbenders can keep themselves like warm, that like it's just some sort of a boost to your physical skills that is assisted by airbending. I don't know. It's getting kind of weird when you start completely making up techniques. But yeah, that's that. But that's the thing. Like it feels like there is definitely still room for new techniques to be introduced in Avatar for sure. So I'm very interested to see. Airbend to take. Yeah, like it's getting a little bit into the science stuff here of just like what if they could do this specific thing with air. Like healing for water is weird, but it makes sense. Same with seismic for earth. I guess air is going to be like that. Yeah, it is tough in that Janora's spiritual projection technique. It's kind of like hard to picture like where the airbending really comes in. But I think the implication of that is that like she can sort of like put her spirit like kind of on the wind in a way of like she can float her spirit over there where more easily that other people can't actually do, and it's something along those ideas. Bending nullification. That is an interesting prospect, but you know we're getting really into the weeds of that. To wrap up, next stream will very much just depend on if I come up with a topic I feel is good for doing on stream. If other stuff happens that creates a topic worth talking about, announcements for stuff happening. We're just waiting for everything. We're waiting for comics. We're waiting for novels. We're waiting for merchandise. One Chi Tongue Adventure Guide obviously will be next few weeks. There will be, I think they said there will be some new Wan Chi Tong information. There'll be adventures for, I think, one for each of the eras in that. So that's something. So yeah, I don't know. The next stream may end up just being sort of like an equivalent review type thing to this, but for the Wan Chi Tong Adventure Guide. We'll see where we go. And you know, again, always like recommend me ideas on like my videos and stuff like that. And you know, I might do them in future videos, future streams, and so on. I'm going to wrap it up there before we just keep going on and on. So thanks everyone for coming out to the stream. I don't know if can you guys hear the cat there? It's probably too far away from the microphone. It probably just about comes over on the sound. He's making some really weird noises over there. I think he's looking for my sister, but anyway, yeah. He just does weird things like that sometimes. Thanks for joining the stream, but that has been it. Thanks for watching, and bye.